after I hit record. And so now the people who will be watching later will be joining us and seeing what the rest of us are seeing. We want to make sure that you ask that you stay muted at all times. You are welcome to use the chat function to submit questions. We will have time at the end to answer questions, as many as we can. If you haven't already, you probably want to switch to speaker view rather than gallery view so that you see me and eventually Pete in our full glory, as opposed to just a whole big grid of faces. You'll also be receiving an email with a survey. I'll be sending it once in the next few minutes, and I'll send it again on Monday morning. The first portion of the survey is demographic information, which helps us with grants, which is another way that we at the History Center are able to survive, grow, and thrive. And the second portion of the survey is going to ask how we did, so that we can improve in the future. So I really hope that we hear from all of you. And so without any further ado, it is my pleasure and honor to introduce the man of the evening, Pete Kelley. Pete is a graduate of Cal Poly and served several terms on the board of directors of the History Center, including as president, and is a longtime chair of our exhibits committee. He is currently the president of the Avila Beach Community Services District, and I'm sure many of you will remember his rightly celebrated career as a restaurateur, operating places in Avila and San Luis Obispo. Pete is also an author and historian, for which he was given the History Center's 2020 Award for Local Historic Scholarship. He is the author of the latest book, The Quick and the Dead: Resistance, Banditry, and Vigilance Revisited on the Central Coast. And I, for one, am excited to hear him speak about it. So take it away, Pete.
Thank you. Well, we're going to start off on a tiny island 300 miles off the coast of Valparaiso, Chile, called Robinson Crusoe Island. And there in 1972, I was camped out in the woods with a couple of friends, and I read Pablo Neruda's The Life and Struggle of Joaquin Murrieta. And I thought, wow, Joaquin Murrieta's from Chile? And then I read about all the Chileans that came up to California in 1848 and 49 for the gold rush. And that got me thinking. And later on, I saw the play in Theater in the Round in Mexico City, and it was fantastic. Well, I'd read the Bible, or the first Joaquin Murrieta book was done by a guy called Yellowbird. Roland Ridge was his real name, but his nom de plume was Yellowbird. And it turned out that most of the Joaquin Murrieta legend comes from this pulp publication in around 1856 that sold hundreds of thousands of copies, but people didn't realize that till like 50 years later. Anyway, most Californians, or let's put it this way, a lot more Californians have heard of Joaquin Murrieta than they have of Pio Linares, Jack Powers, and Walter Murray. But upon coming back to San Luis Obispo and volunteering at the History Center for the exhibits, and specifically the Rancho exhibit, that's when I ran into Pio, Walter, and Jack Powers. And then Dick Hitchman, an amazing professor at Cuesta, gave a talk to the History Center, and he took a different track on the official story. And so just to get everybody straightened out here, I'm going to read on something from the back cover of my book. Here it is. Between May 13th and June 28th in the year 1858, 7 Californios were hung by vigilantes at the San Luis Obispo mission. Another Californio was hunted down and shot by the same vigilante posse. Previously citizens of Mexico, these men were all Americans when their necks were stretched. The official story is that the vigilantes rid the country of murderous bandits, the so-called Pio Linares gang. My story is a little different. I focus on three main players: Walter Murray, Pio Linares, and Jack Powers. Was Walter Murray the good, Jack Powers the bad, and Pio Linares the ugly? Let us dig deeper into that tumultuous time when California was taken from Mexico and bring those events into sharper focus. So after listening to Dick Hitchman's story, and when we were doing the Rancho exhibit, we noticed that the letter that Joaquin Valenzuela wrote on the gallows was different in Spanish than it was in English. And we kind of figured out that it was Walter Murray that did the translation. So after listening to Professor Hitchman and after he figured this out, we finally came to the conclusion that there were cracks in the official story. And I came up with one saying in the book, which I'm proud of, and that's: these miners, the American miners, had a liquor bottle in one pocket and manifest destiny in the other. And of course, racism plays a big role in all this. The Californians were referred to by Murray and others as greasers. The original Joaquin Murrieta, written by Yellowbird, his name was really Roland Ridge. So how did I go about writing this book? Well, the research room, I was a volunteer in the research room, and I got to look at everything we had in the collection. And we had a whole box just on the vigilantes, the statements by the vigilantes before they were hung. I guess because Walter Murray was a lawyer, he liked to have these criminals, in parenthesis, make a statement, and they're all available to read. And then, of course, there was a box of Walter Murray's correspondence, everything from the 1840s to the 1860s. And it was real interesting reading. And you can see that Walter Murray, when he was coming over from England on a ship to New England, he spoke up against slavery. When the Know Nothing Party in 1853 was very popular in San Luis Obispo County, Walter Murray didn't support it. A strange thing was Romualdo Pacheco did. And of course, when Romualdo Pacheco became the governor of California, which he was appointed, he represented the Working Man's Party, which was anti-Chinese and anti-foreigners. I kind of have the feeling that Romualdo Pacheco Jr. considered himself pure Spanish and royalty, because he goes to England. He was the one that talked Walter Murray into moving from Sonora to San Luis Obispo. And when Romualdo Pacheco went to England, he visited Murray's family, and they said that he acted like royalty. So anyway, I started, because of my interest in banditos and the fact that I was so excited that we had our own Joaquin Murrietas in San Luis Obispo, I started taking notes on all these things and worked up a big binder of it. And I thought, well, I'm going to write an article for La Vista. And La Vista is a magazine that in the past the History Center was put out, and we wanted to revise it. In the first issue, I submitted a paper, but it was just the beginning of what I finally did, and it was declared too long. Then I said, well, what about a series? And it was declared they didn't want a series. So I said, well, I guess I'll forget La Vista. But I continued on with this research. So after And believe me, in the research room in our history center, there was everything. You can find, our library has all the books you need, all the papers, all the official papers, court records. There were a lot of things that really helped me out. But it became clear that I needed to go to Sonora, Tuolumne County, California. And I set up an appointment up there with the Sonora History Center and with the Tuolumne County Records, and told them I was coming up. And I went up, and man, they had a lot of things. That the Sonora paper, Walter Murray was the editor of. And when the foreign miners tax, which they were referring to as the greaser law, came into effect, Walter Murray writes all about that and all about and believe me, at the time, they used the term gringo, they used the term güero, they used the term greaser. And the thing was, the gringos all marched to downtown Sonora, over 500 of them, armed, drunk, the day that the foreign miner tax came out, which was a tax, a $30 a month tax on foreign miners. And they only printed it in English and Spanish, so you know what foreign miners they were after. Now, in Sonora, more gold was taken out of Sonora in 1849 and 1850 than any of the other diggings up and down the Sierra. And the reason was because all the Latinos, all the Californios, all the Chilenos, they all showed up in Sonora. Actually, the first name of Sonora was Santiago, like the capital of Chile. Well, these people worked good collectively, and they had their little stores and their tortillerias, and they brought their wives with them, and they were doing really well. Where in the other camps, the gringo camps, it was all everybody's out for themselves, you know? And so therefore, they weren't being nearly as productive as the people in Sonora, and that kind of got people jealous. And they had just in 1850, California became a state. The foreign miners tax was one of the first laws passed. The town of Columbia in Tuolumne County is where the Joaquin Murrieta legend starts. The Sonora Herald was the paper that Walter Murray was the editor of and wrote these articles. And the San Francisco Herald was an anti-vigilante paper, which I'll get into later. Well, to get into these three characters, Jack Powers, Walter Murray, and Pio Linares, Jack was, according to Colonel Horace Bell and to many Californians, the most popular man in California in the early 1850s. He was well known throughout the state. He was known as an excellent horseman, in which Californian horsemen were given the credit as the best horsemen in the world, better than the Argentine gauchos, better than anybody. Jack Powers, the Irishman, who came to California with Stevenson's New York Regiment, which a lot of people don't know about, but this is very important. Before the gold rush, besides, of course, the Native Americans, and besides the trappers and otter hunters and Fremont's Buckskin Brigade, there were 500 Mormons that came in the South, from the South. They were in Los Angeles, then they spread all over the state. And Stevenson's New York Regiment was 1,000 strong. And it was created in New York City by President Polk, especially to come to California, so we would have people to colonize it after we won the Mexican War. So these were young Irishmen that had just left Ireland because of the potato famine or before. And New York had Tammany Hall, and it was the party, which was the Democrats, was corrupt. And if you wanted to do business, you had to go to Tammany Hall, and they called that area Hell's Kitchen. Well, this is where Jack Powers came out of, and a lot of other guys. Well, so they show up in California, and this was the longest foreign sojourn of American troops in history up to this time. From New York all the way around the Cape up to San Francisco. 3 companies sailed down to Santa Barbara. Now, each company is about 100 men, and that was the most were in Santa Barbara than any other coastal town. And the thing is, even though in those days, right before the gold rush, Los Angeles was the biggest city in California, Santa Barbara was second biggest, but it was also the most, what would you call it, compact and together and cultural center. So these 3 regiments, companies from the New York Regiment were stationed in Santa Barbara, and in there was not only Jack Powers and his best friend John Lynch, but also Walter Murray. Now, Walter wrote some good things about Santa Barbara before the gold rush and really interesting descriptions. He also went to La Paz, Baja, Mexico to fight in the Mexican War. So he actually fought. 2 companies went down from Santa Barbara. Meanwhile, Jack Powers was in Santa Barbara, and he was given the task of going to the outlying ranches and getting beef. And his best friend, John Lynch, was riding the trail between Rancho Napomo, Captain Dana's Adobe, and Santa Barbara. That some people called it a Pony Express. Well, it was really communications for the New York Regiment. Okay, Jack went absolutely crazy in Santa Barbara. He loved the horse riding. He loved the fandango. He loved the gambling, the women. He was never felt more at home in his life. Everybody loved him. Started getting pretty rowdy in Santa Barbara. As a matter of fact, the military was going to ship everybody out of Santa Barbara, but then the gold rush, the peace treaty was signed on the Mexican War. The gold rush happened, and they mustered everybody out of the military so they could go on and colonize California. Well, most people took ships up to the San Francisco Bay and then into Stockton, the Delta to Stockton to get to the mother lode. But Jack Powers and John Lynch and 5 other guys, Powers' cousin, a few other people, they rode overland. And they stopped in San Luis Obispo, and they said people were kind of standoffish, but after a day they got better. Then they went up to Margarita. Then they went up to the San Antonio Valley by Jolon, and John Lynch fell in love with it and came back 10 years later, and the Lynches have been in that area till today. Anyway, they went on and they rode from Mission San Jose across the San Joaquin River and up until the mother lode country. 2 20-year-olds seeing practically virgin California. They were very successful hunting for gold. On their way to San Francisco, they stopped in Stockton. People left the diggings in the winter because it was too cold, too much snow. They stopped in Stockton, and by this time there are a lot of gambling houses in Stockton. Jack Powers had earned $12,000 in the gold field, and he went gambling. By the time the night was over, he had won $200,000. So now he had enough to buy his mom a home in Ireland, enough for the rest of his life. Unfortunately, they were still a week out of San Francisco by boat, and gambling on the way to San Francisco, he lost it all except his original 12,000. So now we're talking 1850. The gold rush is starting to be in full swing. The first people to arrive were the Chileans, because all the ships went around the Straits of Magellan, Cape Horn. They'd pull into Valparaiso, Chile, and the Chilenos would hop on. They were experiencing this kind of gold fields, and they got to California. So there was a part of San Francisco called Little Chile, and the Irish people from Hell's Kitchen in New York were now running San Francisco politically. They called themselves the Hounds, or in Spanish, the Galgos. And they basically were enforcers for City Hall and the sheriff. If you wanted to start a bar or you wanted to start a restaurant or whatever, you had to pay bribes to these guys. Well, a Chilean owed $500 to the city, and the mayor said to the Hounds, you collect the money and you can get half of it. Well, they got all tanked up and invaded Little Chile and burnt down the tents and raped a few women, and I think one person was shot. And that's when the first vigilante committee was formed in San Francisco. And it wasn't formed against the Latinos. It was formed against the Irish and this Tammany Hall. Well, Jack Powers was arrested and he went on trial, but he was found not guilty of what happened in Little Chile, the burning down, the rapes and all that. So they let him go. Well, he goes back up to the Mother Lode and for one more year mines gold. Then he comes back down to San Francisco and he sees that all his old buddies from Santa Barbara are running cattle up to San Francisco and making a fortune, where a steer was worth $1 in San Luis Obispo or Santa Barbara, it was worth $80 in San Francisco. And Jack lived in the Mission District, real close to where all these cattle were being brought in before they were, some were sold in San Francisco, some were loaded on ships and sent to the Mother Lode. So Jack decides, shoot, I'm tired of digging in this cold river and going for gold. I'm going to start running cattle. So he goes back down to Santa Barbara. In Santa Barbara, certain things happen with him. He decides he's going to become a farmer and takes over the land, what's now called Henry's or Arroyo Burro, which is right on the beach by the mesa. And he decides he's going to homestead that land. Well, it turned out that land belonged to Richard Den. And Richard Den owned all the property between Mission, Santa Barbara, and Goleta. And he didn't want any squatters because that could threaten the title on all his property. And by the way, that title was given by the last governor, Pio Pico, and mainly Pio Pico's titles were all overturned by the US courts when they finally came to court in the 1860s. And it turned out Jack was right that Richard Den didn't have title of the land at Arroyo Burro, but by that time they were both dead anyway. So Jack by now is going between LA and Santa Barbara, and he's gambling and dancing and romancing. And by this time he's gone bloody native, and he dresses like a Californian, a Californio. He rides like one. He dances like one. He learns Spanish, and he's just, as Horace Bell describes, he was like a lion among rats. Every description of him, he was tall, dark, long black hair, a long beard, piercing eyes, And there's no pictures or portraits remaining of him. So the picture I put in my book, that was what we think Jack Powers probably looked like. Okay, but let me say one thing here. The only mission that remained with the Catholic Church through all the years was Santa Barbara. Every other mission in California was, after secularization, was taken over by Mexicans. In our case, San Luis Obispo, Captain John Wilson owned the mission. Now, there was still a priest there, and he still said mass, but the church wasn't the landlord anymore. Wilson was, and Wilson had a cantina there. San Luis Obispo had a jail there. So when we say these people were hung at Mission San Luis Obispo, they were hung at a part of a building that at the time wasn't Mission San Luis Obispo, but previously had been, and in the future would be. So let's get that straight. Okay. So Jack continues on with his lifestyle, and he meets up with Pio Linares and some other Californians, and they start riding together. Meanwhile, Walter Murray, he got mustered out in Monterey, and he headed by ship up to the Mother Lode. And like we say, by 1850, he was the editor of the Sonora Herald. And once again, he writes all these good articles about what's going on. Well, in 1853, he wrote this article from what he observed in 1850, the day that the foreign miners tax was put into effect. And it's very interesting. And it's all in the book. And when you read that, you'll see what his attitude was towards the Californians, or what he called the true greasers. Okay. Although these people really couldn't tell the difference between a Peruvian, a Chilean, a Mexican, a Californian, they just considered them all Spanish-speaking greasers. Okay. So Walter ran into Romualdo Pacheco. Now, Romualdo Pacheco and his brother took a herd of cattle from San Luis Obispo to the Mother Lode to Sonora, and also hunted with gold. This is 1850. They came back with $250,000. That's quite a sum. And so everybody in San Luis Obispo knew about Sonora. And when I researched Sonora, I found all these people, Joaquin Valenzuela, Richard Den's brother, Romualdo Pacheco and his brother, they're all in Sonora at this time. So we were kind of joined at the hip in those days, San Luis Obispo and Sonora. Well, Walter met Romualdo Pacheco, and Romualdo Pacheco said, you ought to move to San Luis Obispo. Walter got married in San Luis Obispo. He married a Chilean. And this, once again, Chile comes up, and it comes up a lot. Now, I love Chile. I spent 7 months in Chile, and it wasn't my fault that there were some bad Chilenos and some good Chilenos hanging out. Well, Walter comes to San Luis Obispo. He lands at Mala's Landing, or Cave Landing, which we now call Pirates Cove. That's where everybody landed in those days. And he hears that the Joaquin Murrieta band had just come through town. I'm sure that didn't thrill him. And then he moves to town. He has $10,000 that he saved from the in Sonora. And he decides to do a pig farm in Arroyo Grande. He has no agriculture experience, and he loses all his money. By this time, he's teaching school, and they're not paying him in money. They're paying him in a local script. And he's in a sad way. All sorts of problems are mounting. In his correspondence to his sister and his relatives, he doesn't like San Luis Obispo. He finds San Luis Obispo a disgusting place. But he hangs out there, and he goes to LA to try to buy the newspaper The Star, comes back to San Luis Obispo. He did get appointed to the Board of Supervisors. That was because of his friendship with Romualdo Pacheco. Then he filed for bankruptcy. His brother by now came from Sonora and was living in town, Alexander, when in the North County, in a place called Peachtree Road, a Basque cowman, a Basque cowboy, was murdered. And so was his partner. Okay. Well, they arrest Nieves Robles. And Nieves Robles is given a trial. He's arrested for these murders. And who defends him? Walter Murray. And who pays Walter Murray? Jack Powers. Nieves Robles gets off, not guilty. Walter suddenly has some money. Jack returns to San Francisco. And now we'll move on to Pio Linares. Well, Pio was as local as could be. He was born in San Luis Obispo County from an old-time Spanish family. His dad got a huge land grant in Santa Barbara County, which is, I forget which one it is right now offhand, but it was in the neighborhood of 20,000 acres. It's a famous ranch, Suey Ranch, S-U-E-Y. So, and then he became Juez de Campo, which means judge of the countryside. He was a respected citizen. He got the grant for La Cañada de los Osos Rancho, which was all the way from Foothill all the way to Morro Bay over to Montaña de Oro. His partner Badia gets the Isla Pecho Ranch, and then he finally gets Ranchito Santa Fe, the smallest land grant, which is where the Nature Conservancy has the Octavio Barn now on South Higuera or Lower Higuera. So that now is Victor Linares, Pio's dad's place. Well, Pio, we know that he worked as a bronc buster at the Dana Adobe, and they said he was by far the best bronc buster they ever saw, that no one was as good at his horses as Pio Linares was. And then I decided, well, shoot, I'm going to look up and see if there's any legal records of Pio Linares. By golly, there was. His father had died and his mother had inherited the Ranchito Santa Fe. All the other property had been sold by now. The Los Osos, La Cañada de los Osos was sold to Captain John Wilson. His other Suey Ranch was sold before that. But in his youth, Victor Linares was sent by the governor to escort this ship, that there were a lot of English that were illegally in California, and they decided they would arrest these illegal aliens and ship them to Mexico. And the ship started in Monterey, stopped in Santa Barbara, and Victor Linares, who was the sergeant at arms. John Price of the Price House was one of these Englishmen, illegal aliens. Well, they took him to San Blas, Mexico, and then marched them to Tepic, where they were going to be put on trial. Well, because Britannia ruled the seas and Mexico owed a lot of money to England, all the charges were dropped, and the Mexicans said the Californians had to pay damages to these Englishmen that were in California. So Did John Price hate Victor Linares? We don't know. There was a lot of propaganda that said these illegal alien gringos were treated poorly on the ship, but there's no evidence of that. That was just a story, a pro-gringo story. According to Bancroft, they were treated the way other people would have been treated and not like slaves. None of them died. So anyway, if there was any bad blood against Victor Linares, that was probably it. So Pio, meanwhile, tried to get the courts to appoint a guardian to his younger sister, and to make sure his sister got an education, because his mom had been kind of going crazy and he didn't think that she was doing a good job with his little sister. So here he was going to court to try to protect his sister. He also went to court on the ranch, you know, when his dad died, the whole estate, you have to pay off debts and stuff. And he worked on that. And he was also in court. We found this one document at the History Center, which my friend Joe showed me. He goes, Pete, is this important? And I looked at it, it was in Spanish, and it was signed by Pio Linares. It was a court order, or it was him pleading to the court. So I went, wait a minute, this doesn't sound like who they're calling the bloodiest bandit on the El Camino. And so I had it translated. It's not that I didn't understand the Spanish, I just couldn't read the handwriting, and I didn't know some of the slang. So I got a local lady that knew all that stuff to translate it for me. And Pio had been bullied by these other Californians, and they'd stole his horse and his saddle, and he wanted it back. So he went to court, and that was all resolved. So here it looks like who everybody's referring to as the bloodiest bandit on the El Camino, as far as all the legal documents, didn't seem too bloody. It just seemed like a red-blooded Californian who was trying to protect his family and his sister. And of course, when you look back at all the property the family lost, you could understand his resentment. And you could certainly, if he didn't go to Sonora himself on one of these cattle drives, he certainly heard about all of it. So here we got a 20 years old in 1980, married. So by 58, he would have been 28 years old. And another funny thing is that if you look at, there's a lot of papers online now. We're talking about old time California papers. And the vigilantes always like to talk about how bloody El Camino was and all the bodies that were found all the time. Well, if you go to the papers, the digital papers now, and you read the papers before 1858, before Walter Murray's stories, there's not that much mention of it. So you kind of think that the vigilantes exaggerated the amount of murders taking place to justify what they've done. So as we get into the holes I found in the official story, now remember that that's why I published in the back of my book, you'll see the letter that Walter Murray wrote to the San Francisco Bulletin, which was a pro-vigilante paper, and the letter he wrote to his sister Anne. And those two letters, especially the one to the Bulletin, were what was later came out in Myron Angel's Thompson and West History of San Luis Obispo, which is the Bible. I was reading it in the History Center and then reading the letter to the San Francisco paper, and it was verbatim. Myron Angel just took that letter and printed it verbatim, which he states in his history. So the things that I started noticing was, I told you the dangers of traveling on the Central Coast seemed to be exaggerating to justify the lynchings. Murray always used to claim that California juries wouldn't convict another Californian, which turned out false. There's a couple of examples of that. Joaquin Valenzuela was involved in a trial in Santa Barbara with another Californian, and the other Californian was guilty, and Joaquin Valenzuela, they said, wasn't guilty. The biggest thing was that Luciano Tapia, who was known as El Misteño, was the one that didn't want to participate. Now, the second murders we call the San Juan murders. They were east of Atascadero. Okay. Well, Luciano Tapia took part in these murders, and he was told to take the two workers that worked for the Bass and to take them out and shoot them. Well, he didn't do it. He let them go. Okay. Then he was told to take the widow, Andrea Lang Barati, and kill her. Well, he didn't do that either. He took her to San Juan Bautista, gave her a horse back, gave her $50 in gold, and put her on the stage. So he comes riding back. He gets captured by the vigilantes and hung. But he gave his statement, which is real interesting. And the thing was, Walter Murray says that they brought the widow down, she gave her testimony, and then they hung El Misteño. Well, the fact is, they didn't bring the widow down till 3 weeks later, so he lied. They hung the Misteño, and then the widow came down. Now, another thing is, in these statements by the people that were hung, and remember, hanging at this time, they put a rope around your neck, you're standing on a box, they kicked the box out from under you, and you just dangled there for 3 or 4 hours till you suffocated. In execution hangings, you're on this platform and the floor drops out and you drop 10 feet and it snaps and breaks your neck. So you die much more instantaneously. So these were very cruel, these hangings. Now, a lot of times Walter Murray will say, El Misteño confessed, we hung him. Actually, and you learn that from the Joaquin Valenzuela hanging, that he confessed to a priest, not to the vigilantes. They make it sound like he gave a full confession to the vigilantes, but he didn't. He confessed to a priest, and this kept happening over and over again. Okay, then another one was both Nieves Robles and Froilan Servin were given a trial, and Walter Murray defended them, and they both got off. The first time Nieves Robles was found not guilty, 5 months later they hung him. That's called double jeopardy. Froilan Servin, Murray defended him. He got 10 years in San Quentin. He was just as guilty as the rest of them, according to the vigilante justice. But see, he was represented by a good lawyer, Walter Murray, so he got off. Okay. Walter Murray never won an election as judge. He was always appointed judge. And what he says in his letters was that, and I believe the judge that defeated him in his election was De La Guerra from Santa Barbara. But Walter Murray writes that De La Guerra cheated because he went around asking all the Californians, this is after the Committee of Vigilance, who they voted for. And they all said, oh, we voted for you, Walter. Obviously, if you were a Californian and they just hung all your compatriots, and Walter Murray comes up to you and says, who did you vote for? Well, what are you going to say, right? So, and remember that Julian Estrada was a supervisor then, and he was the last Latino supervisor in San Luis Obispo County till Dawn Ortiz this year. Now, Dawn was appointed, not elected, but if she got elected, she would be the first Latino supervisor since 1858. Okay, now, who shouldn't have hung? Well, I don't think the Mesteño should have hung. He freed the widow. He freed the workers from the farm, his paisanos. He didn't want to participate in the first place, but he was strung up and hung. The young Jose Antonio Garcia from Santa Barbara, met Jack Powers in a pool hall in San Luis Obispo. And Jack told him this. Now I'm referring to the first murders, the Peachtree murders. And Jack told him, hey, we're going up there to rustle some cattle because these Basques have stolen, we sold them stolen cattle and we're going to steal it back from them. Okay. So Garcia is riding with Jack Powers and they hear shots, and Powers turns to Garcia and says, these boys have done wrong. In other words, there was no intention to shoot anybody. Then they go along further, find a body, and Powers repeats that same thing. These boys have done mighty wrong. So Jack Powers didn't have anything to do with that murder. And the second murder, the one in San Juan, east of Atascadero, he was in San Francisco. He had nothing to do with that. So all this stuff about Powers being the head of the bloody Powers Linares gang, that all comes from Walter Murray. There's not other evidence of that other than people that have read Walter Murray. Okay, now what about Joaquin Valenzuela? Joaquin Valenzuela was a local, and in the 1840s, he was one of the Californians that went up to Salinas and fought Fremont at the Battle of the Natividad. Okay. He came back. Meanwhile, Henry Dolly, who was our first sheriff in 1850, and who was an amazing man, he was a sailmaker from New York City that had sailed all around the world as a whaler, an otter hunter. He had done everything. Well, he married Joaquin Valenzuela's niece. He helped build Victor Linares' home, which was across the street from where the Octavio barn is. It used to have a big American flag, and the Pereiras owned it. Well, that was originally owned by Pio's dad, Victor Linares. And Dolly, our first sheriff, who was an otter hunter, his job was to help build the adobe there for Victor Linares. And he also, after the Battle of La Natividad, he warned the gringos, both Henry Dolly and Breck, who were both married to Hispanic Californian women, he warned them to lay low, to go out to the Pecho Ranch, because all the local Californians were really ticked off at what happened up there. Okay, so now Joaquin Valenzuela was in Sonora in 1849. You could see that in the Sonora Alcalde papers. So he also, when they originally gave the reward for the head of the bandit Joaquin, they didn't say Joaquin Murrieta. They said the bandit Joaquin. There were supposedly 5 notorious Joaquins, one of them being Joaquin Valenzuela, the other one being Joaquin Ocho Moreno, which is the name that Joaquin Valenzuela would sometimes use. Now, he was very upset about the foreign miners tax. he got involved in a lot of things. They said he kidnapped this young baby from a gringo couple, but he said that they were mistreating this kid, so he kind of like adopted him. Who knows? He had nothing to do with either murders in San Luis Obispo County, but as they were looking for the other people, they came across him and took him into San Luis and hung him. And Joaquin Valenzuela's statements are incredibly brave and really worth reading, which that's all in the book. Now, Neves Robles, of course, he was found not guilty. And then 5 months later, he was found and hung. So the point of all this is that perhaps the official story, Walter Murray's official story, which is in the book, his letter to his sister and his letter to the Bulletin, wasn't exactly true. And there are many interesting, it opened a lot of really interesting doors. Oh, one thing I wanted to say is that Walter Murray really criticizes Pio Linares' father, Victor Linares. He calls him a murderous thug and all this. Well, I wouldn't mention that, but except that when Walter Murray was 3 years old, his father changed their name from Thurtell to Murray because his cousin was convicted of this grisly murder, was hung, but he had a trial by a judge and a jury, was hung, and it was so infamous that they made a wax figure out of his face, and it ended up in Madame Tussauds Chamber of Horror Museums. You know, you've heard of that museum in London that has wax figures of Jack the Ripper. Well, it also had wax figure of Murray's cousin. That's why they changed their name to Murray. So on that note, my final comment is that according to the Mesteños testimony, the captain of the group that kidnapped Andrea, killed her husband, the partner, was a Chilean from Oakland that knew the families in advance, and that El Mesteño said he came down specifically to rob the Basts. Okay. Later on, Morillo, who was one of the workers at the San Juan Ranch, had identified at the very beginning Santos Peralta on the streets of San Luis, and they immediately took him to the jail and hung him. Okay. Later on in San Francisco, he identifies this Chilean Zuniga, and Dee Blackburn brings him down to San Luis Obispo, but the widow Andrea doesn't identify him, and he gets put in the custody of two other Chileans and disappears. If I was a betting man, if I had to say who was responsible for the San Juan murders, I would say it was this guy Zuniga, the Chileno. And with that, I'll open it up for questions. Thomas, you there?
I am here. Hello. Thank you so much, Pete. I want to start here by apologizing to all of the folks for the technical issues we've had. We've got another 20 people or so that have managed to join us. I also want to point out that it has been recorded. So if you did miss any portion of this, we will be posting it on the website, and I'll be emailing the link out to everyone who did register. And then I believe, John, you at this point wanted to say a couple of words while people submit questions. If anybody has any questions or anything they want clarification on, please do go ahead and use the chat box and submit those, and we'll get as many of those answered as possible. Okay, I need to unmute John. And now I have to find him. Isn't technology wonderful? I really appreciate everybody's patience in
I think I'm unmuted now on one of the two places I logged in on, and I hope everybody's able to hear me now.
I can hear you.
Great, thank you all. Pete, thank you for that. That's and we do have some interesting comments already from a couple of people here, and I'll let Thomas kind of sort through those and prioritize those as they come in. I do want to encourage anybody who has questions about Pete, for Pete, about this whole topic. It's obvious Pete has done a tremendous amount of research, traveling the ends of the earth, it looks like, to get to all of the materials that he needs for this. And I was especially interested in making this the subject of our upcoming, well, now here, the Carnegie lecture we have today in March. We have these Carnegie lectures every 3 months. And I just wanted to give you a very quick sneak preview of the next ones we're going to have. The History Center just started this tradition, as it were, in the fall of 2019. Our first Carnegie lecture, in fact, coincided with the 250th anniversary of the arrival of the first Europeans to the Central Coast, which is an occasion that some people, especially those with Native American roots, may regret to a great deal for a number of very legitimate reasons. Nonetheless, we had a good turnout for that. This is the most people we have had for a Carnegie lecture of all. Our next lecture in June, we have these every 3 months, the first Friday of the month where the seasons change. So it'll be March, June, September, December every year. And the next one in June will be about the La Loma adobe, which is not far. It's in the northern part of the city of San Luis Obispo, very close to San Luis Obispo High School. It's got a lot of history, almost as much as our mission in Mission Plaza. And people are going to talk about that. Some of them are on are participating with us here. Bob Jorgensen and also Bob Hoover, Bob Vesley. The three Bobs are going to talk about the La Loma adobe, as well as Bob Vesley has done a lot of research on the old city waterworks in Reservoir Canyon, which is just over the hill. And when I say just over the hill, it's about 5 miles. So you'll have to hike between the two. But we'll have a little walking tour for that, just as we have for this lecture. And I'll just introduce two in September, and then December we're going to visit a couple of other adobes, but not in the city of San Luis Obispo. The one in San Miguel, the Rios Caledonia adobe, and then in Rancho, the Dana adobe down in Rancho Napomo, both of which are incredibly historic, going back to the early 19th century. And we're going to collaborate with groups in all three of those cases. They're discrete individual groups. All three that we honored at the History Center last fall, the Friends of the Adobes and Friends of the Dana Adobe, Friends of La Loma Adobe, they will be collaborating with us. We'll be doing a little bit of work to try to raise some money for those organizations, as well as for the History Center with those upcoming lectures. And stay tuned for the news about each of those. Now that you've participated with us here, we will have your information to make sure you're invited to the next lectures, which should be also equally interesting as this one. One more quick note. We just posted today 5 temporary signs are going to be up all the month of March in Mission Plaza. It will help you to understand the physical relationships of these 5 sites that Pete has talked about. First of all, the History Center itself, which was the home of Romualdo Carrillo de Pacheco de Wilson, the wife of John Wilson, who actually owned the mission. Then we'll have the Gallows site as well, which is right next to our Carnegie Library and at the time, the home of John and Ramona Wilson. The third site is the jail, which was in the mission. At the time, the mission was owned by John Wilson, but used by the secular authorities for the jail, the courthouse, and course, by the vigilantes as well. Fourth site is Walter Murray's Adobe, right across the walkway in Mission Plaza. And the fifth site, we return to the story of Ramona Pacheco Wilson, which is a fascinating story. We don't have time to go into it now, but I hope that you'll all stay tuned on that. Thomas, are you ready to field a few questions for Pete? I've given people as much information as I can so far, and looks like we've got several questions. You want to organize them and start out?
Yeah, absolutely, John. Thank you so much for that. Yeah, we've got some absolutely wonderful questions that have come through. The first one actually arrived by email this afternoon. Can you talk about any of the surviving relatives of any of the main characters in this story? Are there still Murrays? Are there still Linareses? Are there still any of these people around the Central Coast today?
Well, I fortunately got an email from a great niece of Andrea Lang Barate, the widow of the Bast that was murdered. And she ended up marrying Walter. She was a Chilean. She ended up marrying Alexander Murray, and she ended up living her whole life in San Luis Obispo County. And I believe she finally died at the Dana Adobe. And this is in the 19th century when she finally died. And so Leslie, her relative, got a hold of me, and I can't wait to talk to her and we can compare notes. Murray relatives, there was some Murray relatives around that Dan Krieger interviewed in a newspaper article. Beadlow, or whatever that name is, some more people will recognize it. There are relatives, the Herreras are still around. There's plenty of Garcias still around. So yeah, there's a relative of Pio Linares out there at Chateau, what is it? Chateau Margin?
Margin.
Margin.
Yeah.
He's a relative of Pio, and he does the Pistolero wine. I'm really anxious to go out there and trade him a book for a bottle of Pistolero and hear what he has to say. So yeah.
And if I might, Pete, on that note, anybody who would like to order a gift card for that Pio Linares El Pistolero wine is welcome to do so at our website. Just go back to the lecture, and that website has areas where you can order the book, either Pete's book or also Jim Gregory's book, and a bottle of wine, the gift card for the wine. Good deal.
All right, thank you, Pete. I've gotten a couple of versions of this question. Can you talk about sort of the motivations behind Murray's version of events? Why Murray would have told such an alternate version from what you're demonstrating you've seen?
Yeah, it's simply a matter of political control and economics. Murray realized after he got Nieves Robles off that forming a committee of vigilance would be real smart politically, and it was. I mean, after the Committee of Vigilance, he was appointed to be a judge and other things. And he even writes about that, which is all in the book about, now that we've cleaned up these people, all we need is 50 good American citizens and this county will be what it's meant to be. That kind of thing. And also, so it was economics and political control.
All right. There's been some questions about images that exist of people and whether they're true, and especially if you could go into talking a little bit about the photo that's on the cover of your book. Okay.
That is, I took my young protege, Jack Sanfilippo, because reading all the descriptions of Jack Powers, he looked just like Jack Sanfilippo. And at this, Jack's age was about the same age that we're talking about with Jack Powers. So I took Jack Sanfilippo to a studio, and I brought a poncho and a black silk shirt and the hat I have on now. And we took these pictures, and that's what we thought Jack Powers looks like. Now, the other images of Jack Powers are sketches from a distance. One of them, he's riding a Bronco, but it could have been anybody riding a Bucky Bronco. The other, he's standing on a street corner in Santa Barbara with somebody else, but it's so far away, you can't really tell. So basically, that is from descriptions. There's a lot of descriptions of Jack Powers, but no images. We're not sure about the Pio Linares image. It's been at the History Center for a long, long time. They always called it Pio Linares. There were no photographers in San Luis Obispo at the time, and neither in Santa Barbara, but there was in San Francisco. And I have a feeling that that picture, if it was Pio Linares, was taken in San Francisco around the time of the Great Race, which the Great Race is important. I didn't get into it, but it's amazing.
All right. And do we know what eventually ended up happening to Jack Powers?
Oh yeah, we do. And that's there's a lot of different answers. But the story that I researched and found out was in southern Arizona, there was a gold rush. Jack Powers was in Guaymas, Mexico area. He had put together a herd of horse and sheep, and he was going to ride it up to Arizona to make some money. And but first, let me get back to, word was passed to him in San Francisco that the vigilantes were after him. He paid this Captain Bogart to hide him on his ship and sail him all the way around Cabo San Lucas up to Guaymas, which Captain Bogart did. And he didn't tell anybody about this till about 4 months later, which put Bogart on Walter Murray's bad list. What's his name? David Middlecamp did a great article on it where he mentions the bad vibes between Walter Murray and Captain Bogart, because Bogart helped Jack Powers. Anyway, Powers put his herd together. He crossed the border to Arizona, real close to the Mexican border. It turned out that gold rush turned out not to really be happening. So he had to graze his animals. He met these two guys, gringos. He was grazing his animals, and he built a little house on their property. They were missing some pigs. They came over to Jack Powers, and Jack said, why don't you guys stay here? In the morning, the pigs will show up and I'll help you round them up. Well, they said, no, we'll go home. They lived real close, and then we'll come back in the morning. When they came back in the morning, Jack was on the floor of his shack with his skull crushed in and with the pigs eating his blood. And later on, some Yaqui Indians were spotted with Jack's horses and other things across the Mexican border. And so apparently he was killed by his workers. And that was it for Jack Powers. And he ended up, I saw the documents of his estate, and he ended up having like $8,000 worth of property at the time. But that's what happened in 1861 to Jack Powers. He was maybe 30 years old, 31 years old. It's a sad story, depending on your point of view.
These have been fantastic questions so far. Thank you, everybody. Please do keep them coming if you've got any more. There's another question here about Solomon Pico. Do we know anything more about him and why he would have been labeled a bandit?
Well, Solomon Pico, yeah, he was a major bandit, and he was related to all the Picos. Jesus de Pico, the governor Pio Pico, and he was especially active down in the Santa Barbara, Santa Ynez area. And he escaped to Mexico, I believe, and no one ever knew what happened to him. But people say that's the Zorro legend is from Salomon Pico. But who knows? That's another avenue of research.
Yeah, which then leads me to the next question, which is actually my question. What's your next book going to be about?
It's going to be a cookbook. That my kitchen manager at Pete's Southside Cafe, Pat Elkins, him and I are writing a book revealing all our recipes from the different Pete's cafes, and we're making progress. And by the time everything's opened up again, we should have the cookbook. I know I've gone, it's crazy. I went from a history of Avila to my second book. Remember, I started out at Robinson Crusoe Island, The Long Road South, Vagabond Diaries. That's available for me only. And then this one, and then to the next one, which will be the Pete's Cookbook, which I'm happy to do since every day of my life, someone asks me for a recipe.
Well, I'm certainly excited for that one. If anybody has any other questions, we'd be very happy to have them. Otherwise, I really want to thank you, Pete, for sharing your amazing expertise with us. I want to thank my whole audience for being here and bearing with the technology issues. We will be sending out a video of this whole guy who curried lamb burrito. That sounds amazing. Yes, make sure that one makes it into the cookbook, Pete. Gail Johnson.
Oh, it's already there.
Why.
We got it. That's
excellent.
There. I might have some a little later on.
All right. Well, thank you all. Thank you, Pete. Thank you, John. If you are interested in the book, you can go on our website, historycenterslo.org. You can also sign up for our newsletter and make sure that you find out about these kinds of events when they start coming up. We also have a season of events planned at the Dallas Adobe that we're getting really excited to be able to announce. So you really want to be able to sign up for all of that stuff. And hopefully by the time we have our next Carnegie lecture, we will not have the same technology problems. But yeah, Pete, do you have any final words you want to share with us?
Well, thanks for letting me bend your ear, and it was really a lot of fun. And this book has gotten a lot more, it's achieved everything I wanted to achieve. And remember, when the History Center sells out later on tonight, you can go to Amazon Books and get it for $15. The Quick and the Dead, Pete Kelley, and there you give Bezos your $15 and he'll send you a book in 2 days. Thomas?
All right. Well, I'm seeing if anybody has any particular other questions, you're certainly welcome to send them to the History Center, and I will certainly pass them along to Pete for answers. I know I often take some time to digest information, and I'll wake up in the middle of the night with a question. So please do feel free to write to me, Thomas, Thomas, at historycenterslo.org with any further questions, and we'll pass them along to Pete. But if that's all, I just want to say thank you. Thank you, Pete. Thank you, everybody. And I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your evening and a lovely weekend.
Thank you, Thomas.
Thank you.
Adios, everyone.
Good night, everybody.